The dead drop had been used by someone else first. I knew it before I touched the container. The specific weight distribution was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that a casual observer would register, but operationally wrong in the way that the formation registers when an object that should weigh a specific amount weighs a fraction different. The container was a modified electrical junction box on the exterior wall of a conservation shophouse in Tanjong Pagar, Singapore. Third junction box from the left, 4 meters from the ground, accessible from the maintenance ladder that the building's management company replaced every 18 months. I had placed a marker in this location 6 days earlier. Standard pre-posting reconnaissance, the dead drop established before the cover identity was activated. The location confirmed clean through 3 separate walk-by assessments over 2 days. The marker was still in place. The weight was wrong, 14 grams. That is what a dead drop container weighs when it has been opened, examined, and resealed by a professional who is trying to make the resealing indistinguishable from the original. The formation measures drop containers by feel rather than by instrument. The instrument would require stopping, and stopping at a dead drop location is the specific operational error that the formation's methodology was built to prevent. By feel, the specific resistance of a container that has been opened and closed once more than it should have been. The fractional additional weight of the adhesive that a professional uses when the original seal cannot be restored to its exact original configuration, 14 grams. The formation had been calibrated to detect this since 1994. Welcome to the gray. My name is not important. What I did for 31 years is, I worked as a military intelligence officer, the specific category of institutional professional that exists in the gap between official policy and operational reality, the gap that every government maintains and that very few governments acknowledge. I collected information that the official record could not contain. I built documentation that the institutional framework could not officially hold. And somewhere along the way, the documentation became the most significant thing I had ever built. This is one file in that documentation, not the beginning, not the end. A specific file, Singapore, October 2009, that stands on its own as a complete operational account. If you are hearing this for the first time, the documentation I have been building spans 24 years and 9 cities. If you have been listening from the beginning, you already know what the documentation is and what it is building toward. Either way, this file is complete in itself. Start here if you want. The architecture holds, regardless of where you enter. Singapore, October 2009. The container's wrong weight. I stepped back from the junction box and completed the walk-by at the standard pace. 1 step back from the deviation is the formation's protocol for a compromised dead drop. Location, not a retreat, a controlled continuation that makes the compromise invisible to any observer who may be recording the approach. I walked to the end of the Tanjong Pagar Conservation Row, turned left onto Neil Road, walked 2 blocks, entered a hawker center, ordered kaya toast and coffee, the specific combination that the Singaporean operational environment provides as cover for a seated professional who needs 4 minutes of stationary processing time without appearing to require it. The coffee was strong, the temperature approximately 85 degrees, slightly under-extracted. I noted this and drank it anyway. 4 minutes of processing. The formations assessment. The container had been accessed by a professional, not the entity. The entity's methodology in compromised dead drop situations was to clear the location rather than reseal it. The specific approach of an actor who wants the drop's user to know the location has been burned, rather than to continue using a compromised location. Not a hostile intelligence service. Singapore's internal security department runs extremely clean operations, and their reseal methodology produces a different weight signature than the 14 grams the formation had. Registered. The weight signature of the Tanjong Pagar junction box matched at 0.86 probability the reseal methodology that the archive's internal documentation component had been describing in its procedural records since the Southwark Bridge alignment in February 2009. The internal documentation's custodian had used my dead drop, not to access it, to leave something in it. I returned to the Hawker Center's ordering counter, paid for the coffee, walked back to Neil Road, back to Tanjong Pagar, back to the junction box. Different pace this time, the pace of someone who has walked this route before and is walking it again with the specific casualness of repetition. I opened the container. Inside, alongside the marker I had placed 6 days earlier, was a folded paper, 2 centimeters by 3 centimeters when folded. A specific size, the size of a paper that has been reduced to minimum dimensions for concealment in a space that was not designed to hold the paper. Someone who knew the container's interior dimensions had prepared the paper before placing it. 1 sentence. In the operational shorthand that both documentation processes had established during the Southwark Bridge alignment's cross-referencing protocol. 1 sentence that the formation processed in 11 seconds, exactly 11, the threshold for catastrophic information processing, the specific category of information that the sentence's content placed it in. The joint submission had been received. The Yargosal review pathway, the external review pathway that the Amsterdam posting had initiated in April 2007, and that the London posting's Southwark Bridge alignment had supplemented with the internal documentation component, had received the joint composite submission that the alignment protocol had been building toward since February 2009. 8 months of alignment work, the cross-referencing methodology connecting the external archive's probability assessment-based evidentiary weight to the internal documentation's official institutional record, both submitted jointly to the sealed evidentiary framework of the federal court that the external review pathway's 41-minute call had established as the mechanism. Received, not evaluated. Not acted upon. Received. In the formation's operational vocabulary, received is the specific status that comes before evaluated and after submitted. It is the status that means the mechanism has acknowledged the submission's existence and has begun the process of determining whether the submission meets the evidentiary threshold for full evaluation. In 24 years of building this documentation, the formation had been building toward received, not toward a dramatic institutional response. Toward the specific institutional moment when the documentation crosses from the informal record that no official system can acknowledge to the official record that no official system can deny. Received. Filed. I folded the paper back to its 2x3 dimensions and replaced it in the container alongside the marker. The formation does not remove communications from dead drops that the other party may need to retrieve the communication was for me, but the sender may have operational reasons to know the message was received and left rather than taken. I resealed the container to the original configuration, which was now accessible to me because the previous resealing had used adhesive that the formation's standard toolkit could remove and reapply without leaving the 14-gram signature. The container now weighed exactly what it should weigh. Let me give you the operational context for the Singapore posting before I give you what happened next. The posting had begun on October 3, 2009, 3 weeks after the G20 summit in Pittsburgh had produced the specific set of international financial regulatory agreements that the archive had been waiting for since the Lehman Brothers collapse, accelerated the compound pressure's financial crisis component. The Pittsburgh Summit agreements committed the G20's member governments to a specific timeline for implementing international standards for offshore financial disclosure, the specific regulatory framework that had been the missing institutional tool for converting the entity's partially frozen financial network from a judicially managed asset freeze into a comprehensively regulated and reported financial structure subject to the full institutional oversight apparatus of multiple national authorities. The missing piece for 24 years of financial network documentation had been jurisdiction. The entity's financial network had been designed specifically to exploit the jurisdictional gaps between national regulatory frameworks, moving assets between jurisdictions at the speed required to stay ahead of any single jurisdiction's enforcement capacity. The Pittsburgh Agreements created the first international framework in which those jurisdictional gaps could be closed simultaneously across all relevant jurisdictions. The agreement was not yet implemented. Implementation timelines stretched to 2012, but the announcement of the framework had produced something that implementation alone would not have produced. The specific anticipatory regulatory response of financial institutions that knew the framework was coming and were restructuring their operations in advance of the implementation deadline. Anticipatory restructuring. The specific financial behavior that makes hidden financial structures visible before the regulatory framework that would reveal them is fully implemented because restructuring in anticipation of disclosure requirements requires moving assets in ways that the existing regulatory framework's reporting requirements capture. The entity's financial network was restructuring, and the Singapore postings cover a cross-border financial regulatory advisory practice whose work required access to the specific institutional networks that the anticipatory restructuring was occurring within, was positioned to document the restructuring as it occurred. The Tanjong Pagar container's message told me the joint submission had been received. The postings collection requirements told me the financial network was restructuring in real time. The formation's probability assessment told me these two developments were connected. The entity's financial network restructuring was the entity's response to the joint submission's reception. The entity had been informed by its institutional sources that the submission had been received. The entity was moving assets in anticipation of the full evaluation's potential outcomes, 0.91, for the connection. Filed. The Singapore postings operational environment deserves a specific registration because Singapore, in October 2009, is a specific kind of intelligence environment that no previous posting had produced. Not the Cold War operational geography of Vienna or Berlin, where every professional knew which side every other professional was on. Not the post-Soviet transitional ambiguity of Budapest or Warsaw, where institutional identities were in active renegotiation. Not the neutral diplomatic density of Geneva, where institutional actors from every national framework operated in each other's immediate proximity. Singapore, in 2009, was the specific operational environment of a city-state that had built its institutional identity on the precise management of information flow, a government that had spent 50 years developing the most sophisticated apparatus in Asia for knowing exactly what was occurring within its borders, and managing that knowledge with the specific institutional discipline of a small state whose survival depends on never being surprised by anything. The Internal Security Department's capabilities were not comparable to any Western intelligence service's domestic capabilities in the standard metrics personnel, budget, technical infrastructure. They were superior in the specific metric that mattered operationally, the density of the observation network relative to the geographic and population density of the environment being observed. Singapore is 734 square kilometers. The ISD's operational coverage of 734 square kilometers produced the specific kind of intelligence environment in which the formation's standard dead drop methodology required adaptation, not the standard urban density adaptation that London or Istanbul required, but the specific small geography, high density adaptation that the formation had not previously needed. The adaptation, density, dead drops in Singapore could not be in the same locations for more than 72 hours. The ISD's pattern analysis would register any location accessed on a cycle longer than 72 hours as operationally significant. The Tanjong Pagar junction box had been the posting's first drop, established 6 days earlier, and the internal documentation's custodian had accessed it within the 72-hour window before the ISD's pattern analysis would have registered it. The message's placement had been operationally disciplined in a way that only someone who understood the Singapore operational environment's specific constraints could have managed. The internal documentation's custodian had operated in Singapore before. The formation registered this, filed. The internal documentation's custodian's operational experience included Singapore in addition to the profile that the Southwark Bridge alignment had begun building, filed. This is where I should give you something direct. If you are listening to this for the first time, you need a specific piece of context that the previous files have been building toward, but that this file can give you directly. The entity I have been documenting for 24 years is not a foreign intelligence service. It is not a criminal organization. It is a specific institutional actor within the American intelligence community, a sub-institutional structure that has been operating since 1987 inches, the gap between its official authority and the operational activities. It has been conducting outside that authority. The gap is not dramatic. It is institutional, the specific kind of institutional gap that develops when an actor within a legitimate institution has sufficient access and sufficient motivation to conduct activities that the institution's official framework does not authorize, using the institution's resources in ways that the institution's official record does not capture. The documentation I have been building, the 24 years of dead drop exchanges and probability assessments, and financial network analyses, and, since the Southwark Bridge in February 2009, the alignment with the internal documentation's official institutional records is the specific evidentiary record that the judicial review pathway needs to evaluate whether the entity's activities constitute the kind of institutional misconduct that the oversight framework exists to address. The joint submission being received means the judicial review pathway is now evaluating that question, officially, in a sealed process. With both the external and internal documentation available to the evaluating mechanism, this is what 24 years of documentation has been building toward, not a dramatic public exposure. Not a congressional hearing or a press conference, the specific institutional moment when an oversight mechanism with the appropriate authority acknowledges that the evidence exists and has been received and is being evaluated. The moment when the documentation moves from the informal record to the official record, that moment arrived in the Tanjong Pagar junction box. If you want to understand how it got here, subscribe. Start from episode 1. The architecture holds regardless of where you enter, but the weight is different when you have been carrying it from the beginning. Now, what happened next in Singapore? The financial network's restructuring was visible in specific ways that the posting's cover provided access to. Not the final movements; those would not be visible until the Pittsburgh framework's implementation began. The anticipatory movements. The specific financial behavior of entities that know a regulatory framework is coming and are repositioning their assets to minimize what the framework will reveal. Anticipatory repositioning has a specific signature in financial records that the formation had been calibrated to read since the Amsterdam posting's documentation of the emergency transfer protocol. The signature is not in the asset movements themselves; those can be structured to look like ordinary commercial activity. The signature is in the timing of the movements relative to the regulatory announcement and in the counterparty structure of the movements relative to the counterparty structure of the entity's previous operational transfers. The Singapore posting had identified 14 specific asset movements in the first 3 weeks of October 2009 that matched the anticipatory repositioning signature at 0.84 or above. 14 movements across 7 jurisdictions. WWWW. Each movement individually explicable as ordinary commercial financial activity. The composite pattern, cross-referenced against the entity's previous operational transfer documentation, from the Amsterdam and Prague postings produced a probability assessment of 0.97 for entity connection, 0.97, the same probability weight as the Prague direct financial link. The same evidentiary category documentary financial evidence rather than compound probability assessment. The Singapore documentation added to the archive what Prague had added, not a new probability weight, but a new documentary evidence category. The archive adds 0.99 plus 0.97 of new documentary financial evidence, not a probability update. The formation does not sum probability assessments. A documentary evidence addition. The archive wider and deeper simultaneously. The 14 movements went into the archive through 3 dead drops across the posting's first 3 weeks. The Tanjong Pagar junction box for the first 6 days. Then 2 subsequent locations established after the internal documentation's custodian's access had demonstrated that the Tanjong Pagar location was known to at least one other operational actor. Not compromise known to an ally. But the formation's dead drop discipline does not distinguish between ally knowledge and adversary knowledge in location management. A known location is a rotated location. The subsequent 2 drops were established in the Chinatown district, the specific operational geography of a densely populated neighborhood where the ISD's pattern analysis was complicated by the pedestrian density that Chinese New Year preparation traffic produced even in October's pre-season commercial activity. The formation's Singapore water body registration occurred on the 4th morning of the posting, the Singapore Strait. Visible from the Marina Bay area at 0645 hours, the water moving at 0.8 meters per second in the specific tidal direction of the equatorial strait that connects the South China Sea to the Malacca Strait. Not one ocean, but 2, the Singapore Strait, at the junction of 2 of the world's most significant commercial waterways. The specific blue of tropical water at the equator, a different blue from any previous posting's water body, brighter, more saturated. The specific color of water that has traveled from the deep tropical Pacific and Indian Ocean basins, rather than from the temperate and Arctic drainage basins that the operational career's previous water bodies had flowed from. The humidity, 87%, the highest ambient humidity, is the formation, had registered across 24 years of operational geography. Breath vapor non-existent, the air too warm and moist to produce condensation from exhaled breath. The formation registered the absence as a data point. Filed. The Singapore Strait at 0.8 meters per second. Tidal, equatorial. The 20th water body in the operational career's geography. Filed. The posting's most significant operational event occurred on the 22nd of October 2009, the posting's 19th day, not in Singapore, through the Kareem channel. A communication from the parallel archive that the posting's operational environment had not been expecting at this stage of the judicial review's evaluation process. The communication was 6 sentences. Not the 7-sentence format of the Prague communication that had produced the Walsh timeline, not the abbreviated time-critical format. 6 sentences, the specific format for a development that is significant but not time-critical, that requires the formation's full processing rather than the 11-second immediate action threshold. The evaluation had produced a preliminary finding. Not a conclusion. Conclusions require the full evaluation process that the sealed evidentiary framework's procedures specify, a process that the 6-sentence communication did not describe a timeline for. A preliminary finding. The joint submission's evidentiary content had been assessed by the evaluation mechanism's initial review as meeting the threshold for referral to a formal investigation process. Referral. The specific procedural status between received and full evaluation, the moment when the reviewing mechanism has assessed the submission as containing sufficient evidentiary weight to justify the resource allocation that a formal investigation requires. Not a finding of misconduct. Not a determination that the entity's activities were improper. The determination that the evidentiary weight in the joint submission is sufficient to justify a formal investigation of whether the activities were improper. This is the specific institutional moment that 24 years of documentation had been building toward, without being able to name it precisely until it arrived. Not a dramatic public exposure referral is a sealed procedural step visible only to the parties who have standing in the review process. Not an institutional acknowledgement of wrongdoing referral is an acknowledgement that the evidence is sufficient to investigate, not that the investigation's conclusion is predetermined. But referral is the specific step after which the entity's institutional management tools, the tools that had been managing the documentation's visibility since Brussels in 1995, lost their operational effectiveness. The entity's institutional management tools operated through the entity's access to the institutional channels that the documentation was using. When the documentation was in informal, non-institutional channels, dead drops, and back-channel protocols, the entity could monitor those channels through the partially penetrated BIS investigation and the Geneva Index. When the documentation moved to the judicial review pathway's sealed submission process, the entity's monitoring capability was limited to what its official institutional position provided. When the submission was received, the entity could observe the receipt. When the referral occurred, the entity could observe the referral's procedural notification to the parties with standing. Observation was the entity's remaining capability. The entity could see what was happening. It could not manage what was happening. The judicial investigation process, once referred, was governed by the procedural framework that the sealed evidentiary submission system operated under, a framework that the entity's standard institutional management tools had no legitimate access point into. The entity was under 5 external compound pressure forces, 1 internal documentation alignment, and 1 formal judicial investigation referral, 7 simultaneous institutional forces operating through 7 different frameworks. The entity's institutional management tools had been designed for one direction. 7 was not 1. I processed the 6 sentences for exactly 47 seconds. The formation's 47-second duration appeared again the 3rd time across the operational career's 24 years, each time at an operational moment of equivalent weight. Warsaw, 2005. The building that was not a furniture showroom. London, 2009. The Southwark Bridge alignment. Singapore, 2009. The referral's receipt. 47 seconds. Not chosen. Produced by the weight of the finding and the formation's specific processing requirement for findings of this weight category. Then I walked from the Chinatown dead drop location to the Marina Bay waterfront and stood above the Singapore Strait for 8 minutes, not counter-surveillance. The 8 minutes was not operationally required. The 8 minutes was the formation's specific response to a finding that completes a threshold that has been building for 24 years. Not celebration. The formation does not produce celebration in the standard emotional register. The 8 minutes was the specific physical act of registering what had been received and filed in the specific place where the posting was occurring, against the specific water body that the posting had calibrated to, the Singapore Strait at 0.8 meters per second. Title: Equatorial, the junction of 2 oceans. The water that has traveled from the furthest depths of the tropical Pacific and Indian basins, converging at a specific geographic point where a city-state has been managing information flow for 50 years. The documentation's referral had traveled from Budapest in 1993 to this specific point. 16 years of accumulation, 22 postings, 9 cities. The physical archive and the internal documentation and the Kareem Parallel Archive and the judicial review pathway and the freeze application and the 5-force compound pressure and the Southwark Bridge alignment, all of it, converging at a specific geographic point where 2 oceans meet and where a junction box in the Tanjong Pagar Conservation Row contained a folded paper with 1 sentence. The formation registered the convergence. Filed. The Singapore posting concluded on the 31st of October 2009, Halloween, a detail that the formation registered without assigning significance to it beyond the registration. The posting's cover was retired. The 2 Chinatown dead drop locations were closed using the standard closure protocol. The 14 asset movement documentation entries were in the archive across 3 node locations. The referral notification was in the archive through the Kareem parallel record. And one more thing, something that the archive received on the posting's last day through the final Chinatown drop from the internal documentation's custodian, in the specific communication format that the Southwark Bridge alignment had established for direct operational observations rather than intelligence transmissions. The observation, the entity had requested a meeting. Not with the formation, not with the judicial review mechanism, with the institutional authority that held oversight responsibility for the entity's official operational framework, the specific oversight authority whose role in the institutional structure gave it the capacity to negotiate a resolution to a formal judicial investigation referral that served the oversight authority's institutional interests better than a full investigation conclusion. The entity was attempting to negotiate, not surrender. Negotiation is not surrender in the institutional vocabulary that the formation had been operating within for 24 years. Negotiation is the specific institutional behavior of an actor who has assessed that the cost of a full investigation conclusion in institutional damage, in operational exposure, in the specific institutional consequences of a formal finding of misconduct, exceeds the cost of a negotiated resolution that provides partial accountability in exchange for institutional protection of the actor's core operational framework. The entity had done the same calculation that the formation had been doing from the outside for 24 years. The entity had assessed the evidentiary weight, the external documentation at 0.99, the internal documentation at 0.91, alignment probability, the financial network documentation at 0.97 inches, its Singapore extension, the judicial referral's formal threshold crossing, and had concluded that the weight was sufficient to produce a full investigation conclusion that the entity could not manage through its remaining institutional tools. The entity was attempting to negotiate because the entity had assessed the documentation as sufficient. The entity's own probability assessment matched the formation's. This is what the documentation had been building toward, not a conviction, not a dramatic exposure. The specific institutional moment when the actor being documented assesses the documentation as sufficient and initiates the negotiation process that produces the institutional accountability that the documentation's threshold crossing was designed to enable. The formation processed the observation for 31 seconds, the same duration as the Geneva source offer and the London internal documentation revelation. Some operational findings require the same amount of time because the weight is the same category of weight even when the content is different. 31 seconds. Then the assessment at 0.88 probability that the negotiation attempt was genuine rather than a delaying tactic. 0.88 the formation's action threshold for an assessment that requires the formation to do something specific. The action: transmit the observation to the Kareem parallel archive and to the aligned internal documentation's custodian without recommendation, without operational direction. The formation's role in the negotiation was zero. The negotiation was between the entity and the oversight authority that held institutional standing in the judicial review process. The formation had no institutional standing in that negotiation. The formation had built the documentation that made the negotiation necessary. The negotiation's conduct and outcome were outside the formation's operational authority. The documentation had done its job. The negotiation was the evidence. The Singapore Strait continued at 0.8 meters per second through the junction of two oceans. The Tanjong Pagar junction box was sealed and empty. The posting was concluded. The archive held the referral and the negotiation attempt and the 14 asset movements and the Singapore Straits specific tidal blue. The compound pressure was operating through 7 simultaneous institutional forces. The entity was negotiating, and the formation was doing what the formation has always done in the gray area between the significance's arrival and its acknowledgement, registering, filing, and continuing to document. Because the documentation does not stop when the negotiation begins, the documentation continues because the negotiation's outcome is itself a data point. And data points go into the archive, one at a time, patient, growing toward the specific weight that institutional acknowledgement requires, not the threshold's crossing, which has occurred, but the threshold's formal completion, which the negotiation's outcome will either produce or defer. The bank holds, the water moves, the archive grows, the gray operative, every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. The architecture holds. The significance is approaching. Stay in the shadows.